right. Hope everyone's having a good evening tonight. Just waiting for everyone to log in. Give it a couple of, maybe a minute or so. Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. Well, welcome everyone to another Buffalo History Museum webinar. We've got a great panel tonight. Before I get into that, I just wanted to highlight some aspects. We do have a Q&A at the end, so if you want to ask any questions, you can put that into the Q&A. I'll try to monitor the chat as well, and we can try to answer those questions at the end if we have enough time. And also, if you know somebody who misses the webinar or wants to see it, I will share a link to a recording of this webinar after the program. It usually takes about 2 business days for us to put it up on our YouTube webpage, but you can share that with everybody, and I'll share it with everybody who's registered. Anyways, we can get the program started. This is Uncovering Women's Hidden History in Our Community. And I would like to introduce to you Dr. Karen King, the Executive Director of the Erie County Commission on the Status of Women. And I'll go ahead and hand it over to Karen. Thank you.
Thanks, Matt. And thank you to Melissa Brown, my dear colleague and friend, who are always the most gracious hosts, even virtually. So thank you all for joining us this evening. It is March 30th. Tomorrow will mark the last day of March, and we are closing in on the end of Women's History Month. And it's been a robust month of exciting events, and it's just fitting that we wrap it up here this evening with all of you to talk about uncovering women's hidden history. And I'm joined this evening by my esteemed friends and colleagues, Dr. Barbara Nevergold and Kelly Hayes McAlonie, and I will formally introduce each of them right before they present. But I just wanted to say a few words about Women's History Month as we bring it to a close. I read an interesting article in the New York Times. There's a column called In Her Words, and it was about Women's History Month, written by Erin Spencer. And she says, Women's History Month has long drawn mixed reactions with celebration and criticism given in somewhat equal measure. But a pandemic and economic disaster has made Women's History 2021 especially fraught. Of course, there have been moments of achievement. The United States swore in its first female vice president. The Biden administration established a gender policy council, and it is set to have the most diverse cabinet in American history. Estonia swore in its first female prime minister in January, and Greece, Moldova, Togo, and Gabon all elected their first female leaders last year. Citicorp, one of the biggest US banks, appointed a female chief executive, Jane Fraser. And at 31, Whitney Wolfe Herd became the youngest female CEO to take a company public. But the backdrop for these success stories have been painful. Racial reckonings, widening income inequity, an epidemic of domestic abuse, and widespread joblessness, increased burdens of unpaid labor exacerbated by the pandemic. And I think we all are acutely aware of the specific ways the pandemic has impacted women in monumental ways, from childcare to leaving the workforce in droves, and looking on the future in terms of economic recovery. It will be a long road. But we are here to be celebratory and hopeful about the future and the importance of changing the landscape of our community and the public spaces that we inhabit to become more inclusive spaces. And tonight our panelists will talk about the efforts that they have been involved in for several years in doing just that. But one more quote before I transition. a real monumental occurrence this year. Deb Holland, the Secretary of the Interior, of course, is 35th generation New Mexican and a member of the Laguna Pueblo tribe. She's the third female Secretary of the Interior, a position established in 1894. She is the first Native American to lead the department, which among other things oversees relations with the 574 federally recognized tribal nations within the United States. And when the New York Times asked her to weigh in on what Women's History Month meant to her, this is what she had to say. Women are fierce. We break barriers, run companies, make scientific discoveries, raise families, and lift each other up. But the fact is, discriminatory policies blocked women from fully participating in our country for generations. It's led to disparities in wages, representation, and opportunities that we are still tackling. Though we have more Native American women serving in Congress, a woman of color in the Vice President's office, and women making moves across the country, we still have to recognize that the disadvantages that we face are created by systems designed to keep us out, and that, coupled with systemic racism, makes Women's History Month all the more important. So I thank you all for joining us today. Let me first start by introducing my dear colleague, Barbara Nevergold. Dr. Nevergold is a graduate of Buffalo State College and received her doctoral degree in counseling education from the University at Buffalo. In 1999, she co-founded the Uncrowned Queens Institute for Research and Education on Women and has worked to create a model for the reclamation, collection, preservation, and dissemination of the biographic histories of African American community builders. Dr. Nevergold has collaborated on written and oral history projects, educational curriculum, radio, television programs, and community engagement, and the Institute's signature digital archive at uncrownedcommunitybuilders.com. She is the co-author of the 4-volume series, Uncrowned Queens, African American Women Community Builders of Western New York and of Oklahoma, and Go Tell Michelle, African American Women Right to the New First Lady, which is also in an audiobook form and was adopted as a play. Dr. Nevergold has authored numerous other publications. The topics of these publications focus on preserving Western New York history, including the African American experience at the 1901 Pan American Exposition, the Buffalo African American connection to the Niagara Movement, 1905, and the life of Andrew J. Smitherman, a survivor of the Tulsa race riots of 1921. Her most recent publication is Ida Dora Fairbush, Buffalo's first African American teacher, a pioneer. And that is what Dr. Nevergold will speak with us tonight about. So please welcome Dr. Barbara Nevergold.
Thank you, Karen, and good evening, everyone. Let me go to share screen. Ida Dora Fairbush. Let's see. Well, I tell you, technology will get you in the end. All right, thank you. Ida Dora Fairbush was not well known. She was the first African American teacher in the Buffalo Public Schools. And not many people know that or have heard her name. And of those who have heard her name, they've only heard that one fact about her. And so in learning a bit about her myself, I decided that we needed to try to excavate her history. And as a matter of fact, the Uncrowned Community Builders that you mentioned, one of the programs of the Uncrowned Queens Institute that I founded and co-founded with Peggy Brooks Bertram, has as its mission to excavate the histories of the women and men, but particularly the African American women, whose histories have not been documented and are not well known. And Ida certainly is an example of one of the uncrowned queens that we have on our website. Let me tell you a little bit about the community in which she grew up. Buffalo has had a very long history of the Black community. Goes back to the very early stages, a very early founding of the community in Western New York. And at the time that Ida was coming up and coming alive, somewhere in the 1860s, 1880s, and so forth, the community was still very small. As you can see there by the numbers, the community was perhaps less than 1% or about 1% of the population in Buffalo at the time that Ida was growing up. However, it was a very vocal community, a very active community. Just to give you an idea of the size of that community in comparison to the residents in the city of Buffalo, 1900, when there were 1,698 African Americans, the residents in Buffalo constituted 352,000. So it's a very small community, but as I said, they were also a very active community, very vocal community from the time that they first settled in Western New York. They also established early on in the public school system, which actually was established in Buffalo in 1838, a segregated school district, however, was established because of the city charter that was created. The school district, however, would not allow Black students to attend the regular school district. And just to give you an idea of the justification, let me read the remarks from Superintendent Samuel Steele in 1838. He said, quote, regarding the colored students, they require greater patience on the part of their teacher, longer training and severer discipline than are called into exercise in the district schools, and generations will pass before they possess the vigor of intellect, the power of memory, and the judgment that are so early developed in the Anglo-Saxon race. It's a pretty strong statement. However, the city charter was maintained in spite of numerous protests and even a lawsuit that was brought by African-American parents to integrate the system in 1867. It wasn't until 1872 that African-Americans were allowed to go to the regular public schools. They were relegated to a school called the Vine Street School, and colloquially, it was called Vine Street African School. And that school stayed open until 1881, when it ultimately closed. Ida's family came to Buffalo about 1850. And looking at the census data, her mother, Amanda, was born in Ohio, somewhere around Cleveland. However, her father, John, according to the census, we can't really pinpoint where he was because each census seemed to have a new birthplace for him, even at one point saying Canada. So we have less about him, but at any rate, they settled in Buffalo. Out of 11 children, only 3 survived to adulthood. Ida, who was born March 15th, 1869, her older brother, and a younger sister. I think that most certainly having 11 children during their time in Buffalo and during the time when the schools were segregated, that John and Amanda Fairbush were involved in many of the protest concerns, many of the protest rallies, trying to, again, integrate the schools. Ida went to School 26, which is in South Buffalo. In 1884, she was awarded the Jesse Ketchum Award. The Jesse Ketchum Award is given to the student in each school that has the highest academic achievement. She won the silver medal. She was in 8th grade at the time. And the Jesse Ketchum Awards started to be given in 1873. So this is about 10 years And within that 10 years or so, only 6 African-American students received the Jesse Ketchum, and she was one of the 6. She graduated from the only high school in Buffalo at that time in 1889 and was accepted at Wilberforce University's Normal School in 1890. Wilberforce is the 3rd oldest historically Black college in the States. It was founded by a partnership with the Methodist and the African Methodist Episcopal churches. Somewhere in the early 1860s, around 1864, the African Methodist churches took over entirely as the governing body for the university. And the African Methodist churches, that denomination, took over as a funder for the university. And Dr. Benjamin Taylor was a Buffalo resident, a member of the Vine Street AME Church, and a trustee at one time. Ida also was an organist at that church in 1888, 1889. So Dr. Taylor, no doubt, probably helped her with her admission to the university, as well as the pastor of the church at the time in 1890, 92, 93, of Reverend Talbert, who was no relationship to Mary B. Talbert, also would have been involved in helping Ida to enroll in the school. I will note the $106 tuition for room and board equals about $3,000 in today's dollars. So it was not a inexpensive school to attend. This is a university catalog from 1892. And when I found this catalog, particularly seeing the photo of the normal training class, I wondered if I could find Ida in this. I've looked, and I think there are 2 or 3 women that I think could be her. The picture that you saw at the beginning of this presentation is the only one that we have of Ida. I haven't been able to find any others. So if maybe we can get facial recognition to help find her in this, I would love that. At any rate, on the facing pages also, you note that in the normal course, she is listed as a 3rd-year student. However, in the same catalog, when they listed the candidates for diplomas, she isn't listed. And so that presented a little mystery as to what happened. Why wasn't she listed as a candidate for a diploma when she was a 3rd-year student? I think I may have found somewhat the answer to that question. This is a listing of the articles and brief statements that were in the newspapers, because the community apparently followed her in terms of her achievements, in terms of her well-being when she was at school. And when I say the community, many of these articles and references are from the Cleveland Gazette. I didn't find very much in Buffalo newspapers while she was in school, but the community followed her. And if you note in the 3rd bullet that in February of 1892, there was a statement about her being ill, quite ill, and concerned that she might have to drop out of school for a bit. And I think that that's probably happened, and that's why she was not listed. But she did go back and she did graduate. The community advocacy, as I said, on so many fronts, the African-American community was very vocal about their concerns, about their needs, about pushing for advancement of the race. And of course, now having a teacher or having a individual with a diploma to teach made the community members advocate for a colored teacher in the public schools. the story goes, and Reverend J. Edward Nash, who was the pastor of the Michigan Street Baptist Church, tells the story of the two, the Democratic and the Republican clubs, that political clubs that promised to support the superintendent if that superintendent would, the superintendent candidate, if that superintendent would pledge to hire a colored person for the job. Henry Emerson, it's interesting, was the principal at Central High School when Ida graduated. And so Henry was supported and received the appointment as the superintendent in 1893. And while the story was that he had promised, or the assumption was that he had promised to hire an African-American, he claimed he didn't. He claimed he didn't make such an appointment. However, nonetheless, he did hire Miss Ida Dorr Fairbush in 1897. Again, though, with a little drama beforehand, because she wasn't hired immediately as a full-time teacher. She was hired as a substitute. And the newspapers indicated that it was an experiment. And so it was rather low-key, but Ida apparently proved her ability. She was praised for having taken a rather unruly class and managed it, and that got her respect. The Cleveland Gazette in 1896 published an article, again talking regarding our first teacher, and actually Nelson Fairbush, her brother, was the author of that article. I'm not sure the individuals that I have here, Madeline Patterson and Edith Tompkins, were appointed teachers after Ida. I'm not exactly sure when. I haven't been able to find that information. However, neither one of them taught for too long because they both married. And of course, at that time, if you were married, then you had to leave the profession. But I believe they probably came on somewhere in the early 1900s. And I did find that Edith Tompkins was teaching in 1908, just shortly before she got married. Ida spent her entire career at School 6, and it's possible that she did not teach any African-American students. School 6 is on South Division and Hickory Street, which is not very far from Bennett, which is now Bennett Park Montessori, but it was Bennett School number 32 at the time, and most of the African-American students who lived in that area went to School 32. So again, it's quite possible that she did not teach any African-American students, but apparently she did quite well with immigrant students, Italian students in particular. And because she was very much involved in her community, she worked in the settlement house for African-Americans and taught immigrant children from the South. She was a close friend of Mary B. Talbert's. She spoke at the funeral of Mary B. Talbert. She was a member of the Phyllis Wheatley Club. She was involved with the Pan American Exposition. And as a matter of fact, that was the exposition, or at least the centennial of the exposition that my colleague, Dr. Peggy Brooks Bertram, and I were part of celebrating, that really launched us on this mission to find the African-American women in our community whose histories were lost and not documented, but also to engage the community itself in reclaiming and preserving histories, their biographical histories, so that they could be shared. Ida worked for 41 years and retired in 1937. And again, as I was looking through the newspapers, I found this tiny little article that talked about the board meeting on the night that her retirement was approved. And there was nothing there that indicated any recognition that this woman was the first African-American teacher. There was nothing there that acknowledged that she had given 37 years. And then there was just a little note that the board had approved the retirements of Ida Fairbush along with someone else. And that was rather sad. I would have expected a little bit more. I haven't had an opportunity to explore any records, any school records, and I'm not sure how far back I would be able to go and get those school records, but one day we'll try. Ida's final years also were very sad. She wound up having a breakdown, a nervous breakdown, and was confined to the psychiatric center in 1943. She died in September of 1945, and she had no family. Her brother died, her sister died. Of course, her mother had passed on before her. So she was rather alone, apparently, in the community in the last few years. Her body was claimed by Reverend Nash, who performed the burial, but there was no headstone. I found that information thanks to actually Dr. Ellen Grant, and also to Sean Kirst, who writes for the Buffalo News, who had written an article about Ida Fairbush and gone to the cemetery actually, and wrote in his article about the fact that there was no headstone. And so movement started, funded by the Buffalo Teachers Federation and led by Mr. Jeff Reed, who is the director of the Mount Calvary Cemetery, Dr. Grant, and myself and Sean Kirst. And I would have to say this is what we ultimately were able to place on her grave. And I also have to say, while others were willing to put forth the funding to secure the headstone, the cemetery actually donated all of that, the headstone work to place it. And now there's a final resting place for Ida Dora Fairbush that can be identified, and she can be recognized for her pioneering in education in Buffalo and Western New York. I did write a monograph about Ida Dora Fairbush, what I found out, and about the community in which she grew up. And you can see some of the other publications that Peggy Brooks Bertram and I co-authored regarding other uncrowned queens. Each of our uncrowned queens books have 100 biographies of the women, many of whom, as I said, have been undocumented. Fortunately, we have preserved these not only in the publications, but on our webpage. Go Tell Michelle is a book of 100 letters, poems, prayers that were written at the time that our first African-American First Lady was inaugurated, but came with her husband, who was inaugurated president. Just a word about the webpage. Uncrowned Community Builders is one of the programs that the Institute initiates, and we have close to 2,000 African-American women, as well as men. And the men came along in 2007. The webpage was launched in 2001. From that time until 2007, we were always getting questions about, what about the uncrowned kings? What about the kings? What about the men? So finally we come to those questions, but also as with many of the women whose histories are documented on this webpage, there are many men who were uncrowned kings because their histories are important but their histories haven't been documented. And so we continue to add men and women's histories to this webpage. It certainly gets a lot of use for many reasons, not just educational reasons, some of the reasons we did not anticipate, such as people using them for obituaries. And so the site has been now, or the organization is 20 years old, and we're still working. There's lots of work to do in terms of reclaiming and excavating the histories of African-American men and women and sharing them with the community. We invite the community to submit the bios. And as you can see on this page, now an individual can come to this site and actually upload a bio and photos, and that comes to us. We validate it before it goes online. And then finally, just want to note that we have in the 20 years initiated numerous programs. Most currently, we have a mentoring program going called Big Sister, Little Sister Dialogues, which is a partnership with the Buffalo Public Schools. And again, it's grounded in the fact that women have historically mentored and assisted other women. And we wanted to pass on not only the act of mentoring and the value of mentoring, but the history of mentoring to our young women so that they can take forth that information and replicate as they move along in their life, the act of mentoring. We have a Facebook page, which we launched called Know Her Name, Black Women Who Persisted. And I think as Karen mentioned, many of the activities that we've been engaged in over the 20 years are documented here in terms of, again, ways in which we have tried to ensure that we not only retrieve and excavate and document the histories, but also we have the ability to share them in a way that validates the lives of these women and men and are important to the community. And with that, I conclude.
Thank you, Barbara. And of course, we'll have time for questions after. So just another story of a trailblazing women that contributed to our community. So thank you for that work. And I look forward to finding out more about Ida Dora Fairbush. Hopefully we can find some more photos of her, unearth them. So now I'd like to introduce my dear friend and colleague, Kelly Hayes McAlonie. Kelly is the Director of Campus Planning at the University at Buffalo. Her work involves overseeing the university's comprehensive master plan and the strategic planning for UB's 3 campus environments. Kelly has dedicated her career to educational architecture and advocating for gender equity within the profession. In 2011, Kelly and colleague Despina Stratakokis collaborated with Mattel on the design and launch of Barbie, I Can Be an Architect. She has spent the past 15 years researching the life and career of Louise Blanchard Bethune, the first professional woman architect in the United States. She has written widely about Bethune and is currently writing a monograph on her. Kelly has been active in the American Institute of Architects, serving as a 2008 president of AIA Buffalo, Western New York, and the 2012 president of AIA New York State. And of course, has been actively engaged, as Barbara has, as part of our steering committee for the Trailblazing Women Monument Project of Western New York, which Kelly will talk about a bit tonight. And I've also put the Trailblazing Women of Western New York link to our website where you can find out more. And you know, you mentioned Ida Dora Fairbush's relationship with Mary Talbert. And of course, Barbara did. And of course, Mary Talbert is one of the 3 women we will be memorializing in our inaugural placement of Trailblazing Women in front of the library. So please welcome Kelly Hayes McAlonie, and she will talk in greater detail about the project and of course about Louise Bethune.
Thank you, Karen, and thank you so much, Barbara, for that wonderful presentation. It is so interesting. I think about the intersections between Taubert and Louise Bethune, and now, of course, with Ida. It's a really fascinating time in Buffalo's history, and the strong women who were there, who were advocating for equity in their own spaces at that time, of course, as we do now, and it just demonstrates the need for monuments for us to acknowledge the many contributions that women have made and have been making into Buffalo, but even in the United States for centuries. This is a quote from 1893 from an article called Some Distinguished Women of Buffalo. It was printed in New York City in October 1893. Buffalo has always had clever women. We are told that had a sketch of the town been written when our century was young, justice would have demanded that many tributes be paid to the worth and brilliancy of the women who at that time shone in constellated brightness among the pioneer homes of the Queen City of the Lakes. The unique 19th century womanhood is here. Of course, this article is laced with, some darker comments about our history. But what is very interesting is that even over 100 years ago, it was acknowledged that women have been leaders in this city, had been leaders for 100 years prior to that. So we have a lot of ground to make up. And they are part of what we would call a hidden history. And what exactly is a hidden history? Well, that is a term that is used when the history of a neglected group begins to appear. It also has an explicit message that those groups have lacked a history because society has been unwilling to see them as a separate group with particular rights. Groups hidden from history are hidden because of prejudices against a group in the past, because of modern prejudices, and because of the absence of records. So people like Karen, Barbara, myself, Dr. Lillian Williams, Dr. Lori Quigley, and others are working very hard to address that, and in particular, to uncover these hidden histories. So where do these hidden histories live? Of course, our museums and our libraries provide the forum for intellectual engagement and the vessel for our collections, and the Buffalo History Museum is absolutely the most, I would say, important space in Buffalo that provides that very valuable service. And then our monuments provide the validation in the public realm, and I feel that that is especially where we in Buffalo have been lacking. But we're not alone. You look at this statistic, monuments to women in our public spaces have been very, very scarce indeed. Great Britain, of course, Great Britain exceeds everybody else with 17%, but that's only because they had two queens, well, three queens now that get statues, especially Queen Victoria, and allegorical, i.e. Alice in Wonderland. So when you take away Alice in Wonderland and Queen Victoria, their monuments to women are really no better than ours. Just 8% of the monuments in the United States are dedicated to women, and in Buffalo, only 2. But this is starting to change. In 2005, as an example, there was a monument to the women of World War II that was dedicated in London for the significant contribution that women made to the war effort. This is a really wonderful, I think one of the most important that's been placed in the United States, which is the Boston Women's Memorial in 2003. And what's wonderful about this monument is that these women defy what a monument is, in the sense that they are not actually standing on the pedestal that you see so often. The pedestal is there to engage it, so that viewers can actually engage the statues, I think, which is really wonderful, and it really redefines what a monument is. The famous 5 in Parliament Hill in Ottawa, Canada. There's also a replica of this in Calgary, where the famous five were based. And this is, of course, now very prescient because of the anniversaries that have just passed in 2017. And in 2017, of course, the New York State right to vote, and then last year the 100th anniversary of the passage of the 19th Amendment. So we've been working on this since 2017, and the first thing we did was identify where the site should be to house a monument to some of the trailblazing women in our history. And Lafayette Square seemed to be a really good location because of the tremendous history Lafayette Square has and the importance it has had in our the history of this city. So here are just a few of the interesting facts. Of course, it was, just a couple. It was the site of the 9th Congress for the Advancement of Women in 1881. And then 25 years prior to that, it had been the home of, the location of the National Free Soil Party Convention. So there were two movements that were, I won't say founded, but they certainly were advocated for on that space in Buffalo. So I always like to think of Buffalo's library in particular as our city's parlor, because it is, of course, right next to Lafayette Hotel. The Lafayette Square. In 2017, the National Association for the Commission of Women and Annual Conference, they made a resolution in support of our effort. At that time, we were looking specifically at Louise Bethune as the candidate, and since then we've broadened our scope, which I think is really wonderful, to include two other trailblazing women as well. So who are these women? First, there's Louise Blanchard Bethune, who we discussed earlier. She was the first professional woman architect in the United States, the first woman admitted to the American Institute of Architects, first woman fellow, an architect of the Hotel Lafayette, and an important architect of many of the first Buffalo public schools in the 1880s and 1890s. So she practiced with her husband and their partner in Buffalo from 1881 up until her death in 1913. So, and during her lifetime, she was very well regarded and respected and considered the most prominent businesswoman in Buffalo. When we talk about the constellation of lights of women trailblazers, I think none shines brighter than Mary Talbert. Dr. Lillian Williams, who unfortunately couldn't be here tonight, has done a huge service to us in researching Mary Talbert's legacy and has advocated for the unveiling of her history. And who was this trailblazer? She was an international civil rights leader, founder of the NAACP, appointee to Women's Committee on the International Relations after World War I, attended the 5th Congress of the International Council of Women, and admitted to the National Women's Hall of Fame. So she worked both locally and nationally and internationally in a number of spaces for human rights and for women's rights. And then finally, we have Geraldine Sitta Green, who is a member of the Turtle Clan of the Seneca Nation. And she was a venerable, fluent speaker of the Seneca language, devoted educator of the Haudenosaunee traditions, and a leader in the Newtown Longhouse, serving as a role for head women's faith keeper for the animal clan. So she is an incredibly well-respected woman within the Native American community and also from Buffalo or from the region. The location of the sculptures will be, as I mentioned, on the plaza for the library, overlooking Lafayette Square, which was the home of such amazing events. And so here's a photo of what it looks like now, and here is our aspiration that these three statues, monuments, will be, or the monument of three statues will celebrate these three women's contributions, and they will be available for the public to engage in a thoughtful, interesting way. It will be offset, of course, accentuated by interpretation, by an online presence, so people learn much more about these three women. But that's just the tip of the iceberg. As maybe even more important than the monuments is the plaque program, which is, we have a lot of ground to cover. We have to celebrate all of these women. So this will be a walk-in Hall of Fame throughout Western New York, where we will dedicate statues, or not statues, plaques around the city and around the region that celebrates women's contributions. So, and this obviously will also have an app and an online presence so people can learn more about these women. So we're really excited about this opportunity as well. So we're going to be designing both projects simultaneously so that we can advance them, kick them off at the same time. For additional information on the Monuments Project, our goal is $500,000, which would include installation. You see that there's quite a bit of site work that needs to be done, so that's partly why the cost is $500,000. Funding will be entirely supported by philanthropy and grants. And here are our websites: Trailblazing Women, westernnewyork.org, and we have a Facebook presence. So please look us up. We had been so incredibly active, and then of course COVID hit, and we were a little less active, but now we're moving back. And similar to Barbara, I also wanted to talk just a little bit about the opportunities that we all have to advance the legacies of trailblazing women. So this is an example. As I mentioned, I've been researching Bethune for 15 years. This is a very small exhibit that I work with Canon Design on, and it's at the AIA National Headquarters in DC. And so they have a room dedicated to Bethune, and they asked if I would work on an exhibit. So this was dedicated in 2007, I believe. And you can see that it tells Bethune's story. So it's a very small installation, but I think a really important one because it tells her story to an audience who know the name but don't know anything else about her. Some other initiatives that I've worked on, similar to Barbara, Bethune was buried in well, not Barbara, but similar to Ida, Bethune was buried in an unmarked grave. She shared a grave with her husband, and he got the headstone. So so we worked with Forest Lawn, where she was buried, to dedicate a foot marker on the 100th anniversary of her passing in 2013. So you can see a photo of me with Elizabeth Shue Richter, who was AIA president-elect for AIA National at the time. And then finally, this was a real career highlight for me. I had the wonderful opportunity to collaborate with the Buffalo History Museum on an exhibit, a very small but I think meaningful exhibit on Bethune in 2011 that coincided with the, what was the conference, Melissa?
The National Trust.
Oh yes, the National
Yeah.
Trust, correct.
Yeah.
I
cannot believe how long ago that was. Like, I don't talk about history. Gosh,
I know.
seems like just yesterday, but that was really when you were starting your journey with Louise.
Yes, you're exactly right. And what propelled this, back to Barbara's work, is that I found an additional photo. There had only been one photo of Bethune, and we found a second photo. So that was a real game changer when a historian's able to find additional images of these women, because it brings them so much more to life. So this exhibit eventually moved down to the Hotel Lafayette and is still standing there. So I encourage you to visit that little exhibit when you're down there sometime for a coffee. And then I've also collaborated with the Beverly Willis Architecture Foundation, which is a foundation established in New York to uncover the hidden histories of women architects. And so if you go to their Pioneering Women website, you can look up Bethune's bio that I wrote and sponsored. And I think that provides some interesting photos and good history on Bethune. And then finally, one last thing. This was actually something I contributed to, but was the creation of a Bethune lecture series at the UB School of Architecture and Planning. So, Dean at the time, Brian Carter, approached AIA Buffalo, Western New York, and at the time I was the president-elect, to create a lecture series that highlighted women trailblazers in the profession in honor of Bethune. And so this began in 2007. Now that's fairly common, but at the time in the 2000s, there were not many lectures that were dedicated to women specifically, which is hard to imagine. So this lecture series now, of course, is 14 years old. And we've had an amazing guest lectures such as Billy Chen, Grafton Architects, and our own Deborah Burke, who did the Richardson Complex, the Hotel Henry. So these are small ways that we all can contribute to unveiling the hidden history, whether you contribute to Wikipedia, whether you write articles, whether you contribute to the work that other people are doing through fundraising. There's so much work to be done, and there are a lot of opportunities available. So with that, I will stop sharing and turn it back to Karen. Thank you.
Thank you, Kelly. And just to re-emphasize that contribute word, we have a donate button on our website. So if you feel compelled to contribute, you can go to our Trailblazing Women website and hit that donate button. And there's also additional information about the project and the 3 inaugural women that we're honoring. So I just want to thank you all for joining us. And now I believe we will open this up to questions, and Matt will be facilitating that portion.
Yeah. So we haven't had any typed in yet, but does anybody have any questions that they would want to type into the Q&A or the chat box? You can accept those now.
Actually, I have a question for Barbara. Barbara, I'm just wondering if anybody does have information on Ida or any other women that you're researching. Is there a way people can contact you?
Most certainly through my email, my personal email at bnevergold@gmail.com. But I was going to say too that, you were speaking of the research and my experience. Our experience is that one, it takes perseverance to do this work. And it takes, I think, a love of the history as well. And the fact that I find these stories of these women inspiring, and they are as inspiring today as perhaps they were 30, 40, 50 years ago, or longer, when these women were alive. I'm not so sure, how much validation they got at the time, but certainly the fact that they were definitely trailblazers and left that legacy for us to follow and learn from.
I can certainly, regarding, there was a question here by Ashley Carney, will the presentations be shared for later access? As she's doing a research.
Yes.
I'm happy to send that to whomever, I guess the History Museum, and we can make it available.
Yeah, we will post it on YouTube later on. We're recording, so that'll be made available, and I sent it to everybody who's registered. So.
Yeah, Matt and I were talking about, it'll be interesting to see. We had a lot of registrants tonight, but I think we're competing with the weather a bit. But yes. What's interesting with the virtual environment is that we've seen a lot of people come back to programs, so we are sharing them that way, and they can be referenced. And then, you know, the Trailblazing Women's website, and also the websites, you know, maybe in our follow-up email, Matt, we could share Dr. Nevergold's websites as well, you know, for her work, so people can just link right in that way.
Yep.
Thank you, Cheryl, for your comment.
All right. I don't see any other questions asked yet. We'll give it 10 seconds.
I would also like to say we are really keen to encourage volunteers. It takes a village, so please, if you are interested, please reach out to us. And we also gladly accept sweat equity as in addition to funding. So please, you know, let us know how you might be able to assist, because it will certainly take a village to realize all of these projects.
Yeah, and I think, Kelly, your point earlier too is just, you know, what can any of us do to advance these stories, whether it's through supporting research like yours and Barbara's, or whether it's endeavoring on your own pursuits. Because I think you both, I mean, I know you're both researchers to a certain extent, but also, you know, what takes you down in to go deeper on these stories. And I think that, you know, you might start in one place and end up somewhere else. And that's one of the beautiful things about researching history. But, you know, encouraging people to participate. And I think, you know, by the research that you've both done, I mean, these stories would not be here, what we know of these women, without your endeavors. And there's still more to build on. And there's definitely more stories, as Barbara said, that are, you know, waiting to be unearthed.
Thank you, Melissa. And the other thing I wanted to mention regarding the website is there's also a space to recommend future women to honor. So we want this to be a community-driven project. So we welcome your input.
And I'd just like to encourage, again, people to go to our webpage and to submit their biographies, biographies of other women or men, and, you know, help us to spread the story, spread the information. Again, the internet is wonderful because it's global. And so we are not wedded just to Western New York, although that's the region that we started with, but we also have done work in Oklahoma. And we're going to be doing some work relative to the Tulsa race massacre and riot, which will be observing the 100th anniversary of that tragedy that happened in Tulsa, because there is a Buffalo-Tulsa connection. And Peggy Brooks Bertram and I are going to share with the community what that connection is, because it's very strong. And again, it's a story that is little known, but that deserves to be elevated and has some, I think, some relationship to the experiences that we see today. It was 100 years ago, but unfortunately, there are many elements of that story that are still resonating with us today as we see what's happening.
Last week, I participated in a lecture by an architect in New York named Pascal Sablon at the University of Buffalo School of Architecture. And she's a woman in her 30s who's a strong advocate for women's equity. Again, in her 30s. And she told us that when she was an architecture student, which would have been 15 years ago, say, that her professor signaled her out, asked her to stand, and told her in front of her class that she could not be an architect. She would not be a worthy architect because she was a woman and a woman of color. So this is why these stories need to be told. This is not history. This is our present. And so it just reinforced again. And so what is she doing? She's also advocating, and she's also unveiling hidden histories, but hers are actually much more current. She's talking about women who are practicing now to defy this.
Well, I just want to thank everyone for joining us again, and thank you to the Buffalo History Museum, to Matt Holland and Melissa Brown, and my colleagues. And it's been an exciting month of events. So thank you for attending the events and participating in Women's History Month. Please support these projects. It's so important to our community. And I wish you all well. Stay healthy, stay safe, and thank you for joining us this evening.
Yes, thank you all.
Oh, bye.
Thank
Hey,
you. Namaste. Thank you, Matt.
Thanks, Matt. Thanks, Melissa.
My pleasure.
Thanks, Melissa.
My dog is barking. Thank you.
Thank you, lady. Great job. Great presentation.
Great. Well, have a wonderful